So I'd like to begin with the opening passage, which, as you probably know, is the subject of a lot of interest because of a very notable feature in the very first pasuk. Usually the formula V'daber Hashem al Moshe Lemor is found, and it doesn't, let's say, occasion that much note because it is very sort of conventional. Here we have V'daber Hashem al Moshe Behar Sinai Lemor. That Hashem spoke to Moshe, and the Torah says it was on Har Sinai. And it's not novel that this exchange or this communication took place on Har Sinai. What is novel is that the Torah tells us it was on Har Sinai, and of course this gives rise to the famous question of Rashi, Ma inyan Shmita etzel Har Sinai? Why does the Torah mention Har Sinai, that these, as I said, this charge to Moshe was communicated on Har Sinai? When it's all about Shemitah, why was Shemitah particularly associated with Har Sinai more so than all the other mitzvahs of the Torah? Okay, as I said, this is Rashi's question, very well-known question. Alshikh has a novel and original approach. He says as follows: we find here in this opening passage the expression Shabbat Haaretz, Vayisa Shabbat Haaretz. Take a look at Pasuk Vav. Vayisa Shabbas Haaretz Lachem La'achla Lecha Ula'abdecha Ula'masecha, etc. The Torah calls the seventh year, which we call the Shemitah year, or we call it Shvi'is, the seventh, or the sabbatical year is known in English, is called as well the Sabbath of the land, Vayisa Shabbat Haaretz. Now, the person may well ask, says Alshikh, what is the meaning of this expression Shabbat Haaretz? The earth, the land, does not rest. A person rests. The Torah could say that in this year, the land should be allowed to rest, should lie fallow. The person, the farmers, the society at large, to a certain degree, pauses its agricultural engagement, and that is the Shabbat. The people rest during the seventh year in a way which is in some ways similar or analogous to resting on the seventh day of the week, of course, which is Shabbos. But the expression Shabbat Haaretz is odd, so he says, and a person might wonder, the earth is inert, it's mineral, it has no agency, it has no, let's say, a period of activity or inactivity. The whole expression is odd. He says that's why the Torah mentions Har Sinai, because Har Sinai also was a mountain, maybe a medium-sized mountain, maybe a small mountain, still a mountain. And this was a mountain that also acquired some sanctity. It was invested with sanctity. The Torah says, Hanogea bo mos yumas, whoever touches the mountain, not at any time, but particularly at the time of Matan Torah, the Torah says that the mountain acquired a special sanctity, and whoever touches it is liable to a death penalty. Whoever, let's say, picks a flower or anything that's growing on the mountain, and actually, according to our tradition, the mountain became verdant, became very productive during the time of the giving of the Torah. And whoever succumbs to temptation, or even if he sends his animals to graze there, it's forbidden to do so. So he says that in a similar way on Shabbos, we have the idea that a person, a Jew, is endowed, is enriched with a neshama yesera, an additional soul. And that's why we make a bracha on Besamim after Shabbos to console the soul on the loss of the neshama yesera. This is the additional sensitivity or receptivity to spiritual matters. Well, interesting, Rashi and the Gemara says that the Neshama Yisera gives you more appetite, so that's why we eat more on Shabbos, or the Neshama Yisera enables a person to savor food more so on Shabbos. But in any case, we find the idea of Neshama Yisera, and he suggests the earth, the land of Israel, also acquires a measure of sanctity. And this is why the Torah says, Ki savo el haaretz. That's how it begins. Daber el bnei Israel. Look at the very first line. Daber el bnei Israel v'amata lehem. Say to them, Ki savo el haaretz. It doesn't say when you go to the land. It says when you enter the land. He makes the observation that we find that the expression of regarding the Jewish people entering the land is always described as kisavo'u, when you come to the land, not when you go to the land. It says, Vayetze Yaakov me Beersheva, Vayelech Harana, because he was leaving Beersheva, leaving the Holy Land, and he went towards Haran. There it says Vayelech. It says Vayelech when a person is going to some destination, wherever it may be. But it says Kisavo'u, when you enter the land, he says, because that is where the Jew belongs. That's where the soul of the Jewish nation has its natural home, its natural habitat. You could even say, which he also alludes to, that the Jewish soul derives from the heavenly land of Israel, so to speak. So therefore, when the Jewish people come to the land, it's as if they're coming home. There's not advertisement for the Aliyah department, but there is some validity. I'm sure there's a lot of validity to this way of thinking. And he says that the Eretz Yisrael Ikar Mitzuyusam Shamhu, the essential standing, the essential residence of the Jewish nation is in the land of Israel. He says, and just as Har Sinai was endowed with a measure of Kedusha, even though it was in Chutz La'aretz and it was only temporary, but in a similar way, the land of Israel also has, and therefore it's like by way of metaphor, we can speak, the Torah speaks of Shabbat Haaretz. And he even suggests that the land of Israel is a conduit, is like an intermediary between this world, this terrestrial world in which we live, and the higher world, the celestial world. That is to say, the land of Israel is probably metaphorically higher than all the other lands, and it suggests, and that's possibly the metaphor, that it is a little bit closer to heaven. The idea that heaven and earth meet in the land of Israel, perhaps in the Makom HaMikdash in particular. So therefore, Eretz Yisrael, although it's a tract of land very much disputed, in a certain sense, it is bears common features with other tracts of land in the Middle East or elsewhere, but it also has a spiritual component which makes it unique, and therefore we can speak of Shabbat Haaretz. Of course, as you know, the laws of Shemitah are not applicable in Chutz La'aretz, and not the laws of Shemitah Karkaos, of Shemitah's Kasafim regarding remission of loans. Yes, that is in worldwide, but of course Shemitah is specifically in the land of Israel, because the land of Israel has that quality. It's almost an anthropomorphic feature, and that's why he suggests, the Torah says Behar Sinai, in order to allude to the common feature that just as Har Sinai acquired a spiritual energy, a spiritual content at a certain time, the land of Israel has that spiritual component. And therefore, just as the Jew is endowed with the Neshama Yisera on Shabbos, the land, so to speak, is endowed with a certain spiritual sensitivity on the seventh year. And therefore, it's possible to speak of Shabbat Haaretz. I thought this is a very novel approach. Of course, like most of what we've seen in Alshikh, it's derech drash, but I think very thought-provoking at the same time. So this is Shemitah Etzel Har Sinai, as I said, a creative response to that question, Ma inyan Shemitah Etzel Har Sinai. I want to talk to you now about a beautiful passage here in Alshikh. It's a bit further on in our Parasha. Turn to Pasuk Yud Zayin. So the Torah speaks about Shemitah. It speaks about Yovel. Of course, you know, Yovel is the Jubilee year in which I'll
speak to you at 8:30.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. I was just distracted for a moment. The Jubilee year in which the land is returned to its original owners, and someone who is forced to sell his land is able to recover it, and once he's able to recover it, it comes back, reverts to him, or possibly to his heirs in the 50th year. Okay, this is well known. In that context, the Torah says that when you buy or sell a piece of land in the ancient Israel, one was not allowed to, or rather, one must bear in mind how many years until the Yovel, because this is only a leasehold, a maximum 49 years, could be a lot less as well. And this in turn gives way to a more general exhortation, and it's a mitzvah in HaTorah as well, about exploitation in business interaction. So if we take a look, please, at Pasuk Yud Zayin, it's page 698, if you're with me in the Stone Chumash. The Torah there says, so chapter 25, verse 17, V'lo sonu ish es amiso b'yareisam Elohecha, ani Adonai Elohechem. Do not oppress one another. So he says that this expression, this pasuk, it's rendered here, do not aggrieve, each of you shall not aggrieve his fellow, seems to be a bit repetitious, because the Torah had mentioned previously, look at pasuk Yud Daled, when you sell or when you buy, lo tonu ish es achiv. Do not, I just want to see how it's rendered in the, so do not aggrieve one another. And now a few verses later, we have essentially the same statement. Do not oppress, do not aggrieve one another. Why does it have to be repeated? So he quotes Rashi, he alludes to Rashi. Rashi here says, Kan hisal onas devarim. Let me explain. Onaa is to overcharge or to underpay, even though it's by agreement. But if the buyer or the seller is more savvy, or perhaps has information which is not known to the other party, or perhaps he's just very devious, and he essentially persuades the other party that this land is worth a certain amount, and really it's worth a completely different amount. That's called onaas mamon, and that's illegal. The Torah forbids overcharging or underpaying more than a certain proportion, 1/6. By the way, it doesn't apply to land in halacha, but it applies to, and it has its limitations. But says Rashi on Pasuk Yud Zayin, when the Torah mentions, again in a more general way, lo sonu ish es amiso, so Rashi says, Kan hisir al onas devarim. Here, the Torah is warning about the prohibition of onas devarim, that is grieving or exploiting a person with words. Just to put it in context, we are very well aware of the potency of speech, of the power of speech for good and for better. We all know about Lashon Hara. Hopefully we don't hear it, hopefully we don't speak it, but we're certainly very familiar with the concept. There is another important arena of speech, which is not a matter of defaming or maligning another person, but rather what you say to a person, a language which is hurtful or insulting or humiliating. That's called onas dvarim, and it's a Torah prohibition. So Alshikh quotes the Gemara in Bava Metzia, and he says this is which Rashi again alludes to as well when he says that this refers to onas dvarim. The earlier pasuk speaks to exploitation in buying or selling. Here, this pasuk refers to onah, to grieving a person with words. What would be an example of that? Quite well-known examples. If a person is speaking to a Baal Teshuvah, a penitent, he shouldn't say, remember how you used to act, remember what you used to do, remember where you used to eat, remember how you used to, what kind of entertainment and leisure activities you pursued, remember your time in prison when you were locked up for one crime or another. That is called onas devarim. It's true for a Baal Tshuva. It's, I'm sure, equally true for another scenario of a person who's changed his ways or changed his status and is now living his life as an upstanding member of the Jewish community. Don't say Zechor Masecha Rishonim. Similarly, the Gemara says, if a person is suffering, a person has been visited with illness or with other types of tzoras, lo aleinu v'lo aleichem, a person should not say to him like the friends of Eov said to Eov, who was suffering, it must be because of your sins. In other words, you're being punished for your wrongdoing. That, again, is hurtful, is humiliating, and this is onas devarim. Says Alshikh, with this, he says, a nice turn of phrase, he says, with this, we have emerged from the problem of the repetition. In that, as we've seen, the Torah mentions the word the expression lo son es ish es amiso, and they had the same thing a few verses earlier. So now we've explained it, because earlier was regarding to money, and now it's regarding to speech. But he says what we haven't explained is the connection to what came before. Why does this pasuk appear here? If that was talking about again, buying, selling land that has to be sold for a reasonable, that is to say, an appropriate value relative to how long the purchaser will retain possession of it before it reverts to its original owner. But Onas Dvarim, according to what the Gemara says, it's completely unrelated to commercial affairs, has to do with a conversation with a friend or a stranger, or dare I say an enemy, and what the Torah forbids about it within that conversation. So how is it relevant here? It says Alshikh, very creative idea, an explanation. He says that in ancient Israel, and I think probably in antiquity generally, it was not so common for a person to sell his land. It wasn't like nowadays you can buy and sell houses, homes, apartments, properties. Quite a few Jewish people are in that line of work. Some of them make some money in that way. Some of them lose money that way. It's a very important part of the commercial life of the country. In antiquity, it wasn't that way. Certainly not land that was an ancestral tract of land that a person used to extract literally his livelihood in terms of tilling the land, working the land, whether it's a vineyard or an orchard or land for grain or vegetables, whatever it might be. That is how he supported his family. The produce he ate and he sold for other requirements. He had animals that would graze on his land. So a person it wasn't common that a person would sell land. He would only do so if his circumstances were such that he was desperate. He had no more liquid assets, no more movable assets. Besides liquid assets, he had no more chattel, no more metaltalin that he could sell, and he maybe fell on hard times or whatever the reason. And therefore, to sell land in those days meant you're down and out. The buyer is, so to speak, in luck, because he has an opportunity to purchase land, which, as I just said, didn't go on the market that frequently. And therefore, the buyer could exploit the seller. And he said, I am better than you. I have money. I've got, assets. I've got cash. And you're cash starved to the point that you've got to sell off the family silver. But it's more than the family silver. It wasn't just an heirloom. It wasn't just something of sentimental value or beauty. It was the very basis of his livelihood. He's got to sell it. So he might humiliate the seller to say, you've got to sell. I can buy. I'm a rich guy. He might celebrate the other person's riches to rags story, because they all inherited land originally, and now he's got to sell his land. So that's the connection to the passage that preceded, because there could be a, let's say, likely or possible arena, as I said, of Onas Dvarim in the context of buying and selling land. From this, the Alshikh takes up and elaborates on this subject generally, and he says that the Torah here is warning against what later day thinkers might call a superiority complex. Person who thinks he's better than someone else. He says a person should never imagine that, because obviously, like those examples we were talking about, you're talking down someone else because you think that you're so much better than another person. He says that a person should not imagine himself to be superior to anyone else. As it says in Eov, because greatness and inferiority is something that is assessed, only klape shmai in the heavenly reckoning. And not only that, but the Gemara says, Olam hafruch ra'isi, I have seen a transformed or an inverted world. It's very possible that people who in this world are well regarded, are popular, are maybe in a position of power, influence, authority, leadership, but in the next world, it could be just the opposite. It could be those who are apparently of little importance in this world achieve greatness in the next world. But then he takes it further in a way which I find very relevant, I would like to suggest. And he says, that he says, we shall praise one of the great men of Israel. He never met any man that he did not honor. Now he's referring here to the Ramban. He doesn't mention it by name, I don't know why, but he's referring here to the famous Igeret HaRamban. You may have heard of the letter that the Ramban wrote. Supposedly he wrote it to his son, or he did write it to his son. Supposedly he wrote it from the land of Israel. It's not exactly clear that that is the case, but this beautiful, eloquent, simple, eloquent letter of the Ramban is widely available. It's even printed in the New Art Scroll Siddur. And if I can advertise my Shir on Shavuos night, I'm going to be speaking about that letter of Ramban on Shavuos night as well. So it happens. So here he says, this person, this great person who is Ramban, and he wasn't praising himself, but he was advising his son of how to conduct his life, how to conduct his interaction with other people. And he said that anyone you meet, think of him as superior to yourself. Think of him as worthy of respect and honor. If I meet someone who's younger than me, then I think to myself, he doesn't have as many sins as I have because he hasn't had as much time to amass them. And if he's older than me, then I say, well, he probably has more merit because he's lived longer, he has achieved more, he has more experience and more wisdom that he has amassed. If he is wiser than me, then I say, well, of course, he has much merit, he's a Torah scholar. And if I am wiser than him, then I say, well, I am going to be held to a more demanding standard. The things that I've done wrong are more grievous in the eyes of heaven because I'm a learned person. That other individual that I'm just meeting, I can see he's not such a Talmid Chacham, but it means that he is, whatever errors he may have committed, he won't be held accountable to the same degree. He says, Ashmosai, God lo ashmosav, ki hu lo yada b'mei kashel kasher yichtam al shelo ken anochi. And he says, and in this way, anyone that I ever meet, I think of ways and reasons that I should respect him, I should honor him, ways in which I should regard him as superior to myself. This is what Alshikh says, and this is all included. Again, he's elaborating somewhat on the basic prohibition of onas dvarim, but it has so much to do with a perspective. If a person thinks of himself as superior, then he may well, in an unguarded moment, let alone deliberately, say something to another person, reflecting the fact that he looks down upon him and he humiliates him, he shames him. But if a person regards someone else as greater than him, then he won't cross his mind to denigrate him or to humiliate him or to shame him in those ways, to put him down. And finally, he turns to a well-known Mishnah, a short Mishnah, in Pirkei Avot. It's easy to remember, it's Perek Daled, Mishnah Daled. I read it. Ma'od ma'od have shval ruach. That's one of the sages, said Levitas ish Yavne. Ma'od ma'od have shval ruach. Be exceedingly humble. Bifnei kol adam, but in the presence of any person, and because tikvas enosh rima, because the hope of man is worms. It means that the destiny of a person ultimately is to return to the earth from which he emerged, and ultimately his body decomposes and becomes subject to the is consumed by creatures, microscopic or macroscopic as well. Okay, it's maggots and worms, kind of earthy, no pun intended, really, because it really is earthy. So he asked a few questions. Why does it say ma'od, be exceedingly? Ma'od is very, ma'od is very, very, it's like overdone. Ma'od, he says, why does it tikvas enosh? because the word tikva means the hope. We're entitled this little shir tonight, the hope of man. We always think of hope. There's even an Israeli national anthem, ha-Tikva. Tikva is something that we hope for good things, for better things, for great things, for redemptive things. It's, at the simple level, it's meant almost sarcastically. Tikvas enosh, the greatest, fondest hope of a man, ultimately is to be consumed by worms. So he asked, why does it say tikvas enosh rima in that way? Then he says, because it would make more sense to say shesof enosh rima, the end of man is rima. Why does it say tikva? And finally he says, why does it say enosh? So he explains that there are, it's well known that there are many human characters, human qualities, characteristics, and generally we follow, or we are encouraged, as we do, but we are encouraged to follow an intermediate, a moderate path, moderation in all things. This is the so-called Shvil HaZahav, the golden mean of the Rambam, which probably comes from Aristotle. And therefore we have to wonder, why does it say ma'od haveshorach? What about the moderation? What about following the middle path between extremes? So he says that the reason is that in this case, because a person's destiny is to be consumed by worms and maggots, any amount of self-regard is already going to be a form of arrogance. It doesn't mean a person should think of himself as worthless, but it means that even ma'od, extreme humility is that, even that is a midway point. Even extreme humility, considering a person's destiny that he's going to be returned to the earth and become a meal for I don't know how many months or years it takes. Don't want to contemplate that matter too closely. For earthworms, etc. If he contemplates that, then any measure of arrogance, or to put it differently, even that itself is a midpoint. He says that there are various names for the human being. We have Adam, we have Ish, we have Gever, and Enosh. Perhaps there are others, but he mentions those. Adam is Adam, Ish is a man, Isha is a woman, Gever, Geveret, male, female, and then we have Enosh. So actually, Enosh was the son of Shes, Adam, Shes, Enosh. But Enosh, like we have the word Anashim, is from Enosh. We're all Anashim. But he says that Enosh actually is the lowest of them, possibly because he became an idolater, and all of his, he was only the third generation of mankind, but idolatry began to take hold at that point. Hagarua mikulam hu Enosh, ki alkein lo yikarei ko rak habilti kasher. The Torah will use, or here's not the Torah, it's the Mishnah, the sages will employ the term Enosh when it's speaking about a person who is, excuse the expression, a low life. So when it says that such a person, meaning Tikvas Enosh, Rima, and Enosh, the best he can hope for, he's got to expect, he has to anticipate he's going to be consumed by maggots, which is true for great people as well, actually. He says that, and he speaks about the vile trait of arrogance and conceit. He says that the pasuk says that someone who is haughty, God says, I have no room for him in this world. There's no room for that person and God in the same world. So he says that the Torah, the Mishnah, uses the term Enosh to refer to such a person who is arrogant, and therefore the Mishnah urges all of us to be ma'od have shval ruach. So this, he says, is the tikva, is the hope of man, and he says for such a person, he says such a person who is unworthy, he says lo yimtzamu charmoso ad hiacheles v'tzara bekivro. He won't find any satisfaction or any, really, I should say, peace, any comfort in the grave until his body is consumed. In other words, the experience of the breakdown of the body will be a release for such a person. That's why it says, Ki tikvas enosh rima, a person who is an enosh, a person who is arrogant. person who is described with the lowest level, the lowest designation of human being with the term enosh, a person who has that arrogance, for such a person, he looks forward to it. He looks forward to decaying in the grave, because only then will he finally have the release from his suffering to which he is destined in the next world. So I'm sorry to end on a little bit of a down note, but to put it in a much more positive way, like he says, quoting from the Ramban, that rather than regarding others as inferior, a person should look up to others, find reasons to admire them, to respect every other person, even if a person knows that the person I'm talking to is troubled, is maybe faulty, is maybe actually not the most righteous individual, but find something about that person to respect, some reason to honor him, some reason to treat him and to regard him highly. And in this way, we will be freed of that temptation of the very severe transgression of Onas Dvarim. So we've learned about Ma'in and Shemitah Etzel Har Sinai, that the land of Israel, just as Har Sinai was endowed with Kedusha, so the land of Israel also in the 7th year has, in a certain metaphorical sense, a sensitivity, and therefore we have Shabbat Haaretz, and that's why the Torah says Behar Sinai. And then we've spoken here about Onas Dvarim and the connection to selling land. A person who's buying might mock or deride the seller who's constrained to sell his ancestral land, and the Torah therefore forbids such a temptation that any person might possibly have. Thank you very much. I wish you a good Shabbos, and we will hopefully learn more and more next week. We're starting a new book of Bamidbar, and we look forward to that. Join us for Shabbos at Kesher as well, Pirkei Avos. We are doing Deep Roots for Pirkei Avos at 7:20 tomorrow, Shabbos afternoon before Mincha. I wish you Shabbat Shalom.